Hi, I'm Hamish Black, and welcome to Writing on Games. Do you remember the first time you played Grand Theft Auto? It was one of the first truly open games I ever played, and it was an absolutely mind-opening experience. At the time, I didn't think to myself, no longer am I constrained by the bounds of linear gameplay. Come on, I was like 9 or something. All I remember was thinking, wait a minute, I can kill people I'm not meant to kill? I can take any car and go anywhere? This is crazy. And in a lot of ways, it really was. I remember having the same feeling the first time I played GTA 3. Now the world was in 3D, it suddenly resembled something close to life. It was a facsimile of a real city, and so it felt tangible being able to run rampant and have my imagination seemingly be unconstrained. Although this mainly took the form of putting on a bunch of cheats and gunning down pedestrians. A lot of the reactionary crowd who used to complain about video game violence would say that people only like it for the killing, but that isn't true. The question for the player is how they can bend the rules of the world. Being able to explore a world without having to follow any set objectives, allowing the player to at least somewhat define the scope of the gameplay, was what drew people to these games. Open worlds were these massive undertakings by developers and players alike. The time investment on both sides to make these worlds and to see everything within them meant that the term open world actually carried a fair bit of clout. Someone could say that a game was an open world, and for me anyway, I would become inherently interested. That said, we're at a stage now where there's a certain sense of ubiquity to open world design, or at least a certain kind of fatigue. Whether it be through technical advances or increased ambition, more and more games proclaim to offer open worlds. It's gotten to the point where people are now asking, especially with, for example, Ubisoft open world games like Assassin's Creed or Watch Dogs, did this game need to be an open world? So what happened? How did we get to the point that a type of game that once evoked such strong feelings of freedom and ambition and player mischief has turned into something that can potentially be so dull? Well, I would say that clearly players have learned that just the idea of being open does not an engaging experience make necessarily. There are still good open world games being made, and their open nature can be a primary reason for that, but there clearly exist open world designs that are compelling and those that are not. In this episode of Writing on Games then, I want to argue that in fact it is not simply these evocations of freedom that make an open world sandbox compelling. It's how the world responds to the player's inputs, even if that response seems to conflict with the idea of giving the player freedom. The first thing I should say is that there's actually a distinction to be made here. The term sandbox is often used interchangeably with the term open world. An open world is exactly that, a world which is open to the player to explore. The term sandbox though, as the name implies, is much more about encouraging players to experiment with the fundamentals of that world. The metaphor being that of the kid in the sandbox, creating whatever their imagination can think up, using something as malleable as sand. It's not necessarily about freeing the player. As Steve Breslin writes for Gamasutra, there are many ways in which games offered freedom to the player before the release of what he describes as the canonical sandbox games, those being The Sims and Grand Theft Auto 3. He says that non-linearity, the lack of objectives or central storyline, automatic variation of the game world and game behaviour all gave players a sense of freedom prior to the release of these games. What he argues the sandbox did for game design and for players in particular was encourage them to experiment with the fundamental rules of the world and, more importantly, have the game respond to those inputs. This is what I feel to be what people refer to when they talk about open worlds feeling lived in. They feel like the citizens of the game world are going about their business, but aren't on such a rigid path that they won't respond to the player's actions. This gives a tangible weight to the player's actions. Every action in this world, even non-violent ones, have a reaction. As Breslin argues, to say it very simply, a typical game must respond to correct input, while a sandbox game must reward all input. Although I would posit that a more appropriate term would be respond rather than reward, this is largely what I feel makes games like Grand Theft Auto 5 feel compelling to a player. It's not actually the freedom to do things at all, really. In fact, one of the most recognisable elements of that series, the Wanted level, is one of the most player-restrictive design elements one could think of. Think about it, the game gives you all of these tools such as weapons and high-speed vehicles and an entire world to run rampant in. As soon as your hijinks are noticed, however, the Wanted level begins to gradually escalate and the game literally sends the cops after you to stop you from going too wild. They act as a balancing force in the game, returning the world to some kind of normalcy so the narrative of that world can be brought back into the player's peripheral vision. The player is not God here. They are free to do what they please, but not without consequence. One might argue that when considered in that way, the Wanted level runs counter to the idea that Grand Theft Auto is a game which offers the player total freedom, but I would argue that this is an overly simplistic way of viewing things. I would actually say that without this sense of limiting the player's ability to cause untold chaos, the game simply wouldn't be as effective. Obviously, the game does allow the player far more freedom to do damage than in most games, but whether or not the response from the police is realistic, the player needs that reaction from the world to make their actions in any way meaningful. There are plenty of games or tech demos out there in which you can slaughter however many clusters of pixels as you so choose. This, however, is simply novelty, and novelty is fleeting. The open world of GTA allows the player the opportunity to experiment with and cause this havoc, but the reaction of the sandbox is what compels players to keep coming back to these worlds. Another element of why the Grand Theft Auto games in particular work so well as sandboxes is because of the sheer amount of detail devoted to the world design. This is where games like Just Cause go wrong for me. Their worlds are utterly massive, with the developers claiming that Just Cause 3's map is around 400 kilometers squared? And this is touted as a major selling point because, hey, more land mass means more land to explore and explode, right? Well, no. Not only does this make traversing the landmass an absolute nightmare, it now takes forever to get anywhere in the game. The level of detail the developers can afford individual areas is obviously going to be far smaller. The landmass is quite simply spread too thin. As a result, the player finds themselves traversing huge swaths of land that offer nothing to them. This is one of the key things to remember about designing an open world. One may assume that because of the make-your-own-fun nature many attribute to these open world games, that the designers and developers need not put in as much work to the individual elements of the game's design. The player just needs an environment, a bunch of guns, and to be told, go do what you want, right? Not the case at all. The player needs the encouragement to want to actually be in your open world before you can convince them to actually engage with it. In this sense, it could be argued that the designers must more deeply, yet more subtly, control the player's experience on at least some level than if they were just creating a linear experience. As quoted from Breslin previously, a sandbox game must reward all input, meaning that the designers have to account for every eventuality and try as best they can to provide an engaging response to that. San Andreas, for example, nailed this. As opposed to just placing the player in an environment and telling them to go nuts, it really felt like San Andreas' world was written rather than merely constructed. Everything is tonally consistent, and whilst smaller in scope than the more recent open world sandboxes, every island, every city, every individual place within the map has its own personality. The details such as billboards, shops, general architecture, the people, the cars, the density of housing, these are the things that the player might not recognise as important if they recognise them at all, but they are all subtly designed to give the player a sense of geography that is distinct from the other areas in the game. The player at every stage of traversing the map remembers where they came from because the area they are going to is distinct from the one they came from. And so they internalise a kind of map for themselves. It's to the point where I could almost draw that map from memory. Playing it through recently, if Sweet told me to head back to the Grove from Vinewood, I would know exactly what roads to take, what shortcuts I could navigate, what bridges I had to cross over in order to get there. The objective marker almost doesn't matter at a certain point. You are told to go to a location, and you almost know instinctually where it is. The same cannot be said for games like Just Cause 3, in which the objective marker is an absolute necessity. Just Cause 3's world can look aesthetically pleasing at times, but due to its sheer size, there is nothing memorable about it. Every town looks nearly identical and each serves the same purpose. Each is merely an objective in itself, something for the player to find and then liberate. By doing this, there isn't the sense that the player wants to explore these towns. Once you've seen one, you've pretty much seen them all. The repetitive nature of these outpost liberation missions means that discovering new cities has about as much impact on the player as them finding a collectible in a platformer, for instance. In Grand Theft Auto, the world is bigger than the player. This plays into the main narrative throughline in all the games, that you start at the bottom and work your way to the top. As you progress through a game like Grand Theft Auto and discover new areas, you feel like you're gradually developing a more complete view of the world, and at the end of the game you feel like you have worked in order to achieve that understanding. It's kind of similar to the way that shortcuts in Dark Souls work, for instance. You may have to trudge through an area many times to get through it, but then you unlock that door that leads back to another bonfire, and the sense of satisfaction is palpable. It gives you a more complete sense of the connected nature of that world, and that makes the world inherently more engaging. Is this to say that a bigger open world is a bad thing? Not really. I would argue that the idea of a response to the player's inputs could be widened to the game providing the player with a narrative or thematic response, rather than simply a mechanical one. For example, Metal Gear Solid 5's open nature, whilst presenting its own problems with traversal and how missions work, makes the player feel more open and vulnerable than they might have done in the more confined corridor-like structures of previous games. Like games such as Wind Waker or Shadow of the Colossus, traversing Metal Gear Solid 5's world makes the player feel small, and this has both narrative and mechanical implications. There is a lot of open space for sure, but in games like these, the open space both allows for peaks and troughs in the action and gives the player a real sense of scale. In the Phantom Pain in particular, the player approaches stealth in a different way, with rooms no longer being seen as solving the problem of enemy AI patterns, as they might have been in previous games. Here, large open environments are combined with unpredictable AI, which leaves the player not being entirely sure of their surroundings at any given time, and so are constantly watching their back. The openness of the world contributes to a sense of unpredictability, and makes those moments where you finally reach your objective all the more tense as a result. Ultimately, this is a topic that I could talk about for a long time, and there's so much here I haven't touched upon, such as Ubisoft open worlds for instance, but I kind of feel like a lot of what I said about Just Cause 3 applies to those worlds as well. But hopefully that's given you a gist of my thoughts on the matter. Freedom, contrary to popular belief, is actually not the cornerstone of good sandbox design. That cornerstone would actually be a subtler form of hand-holding from the designers and developers. Rather, they create the illusion of freedom, whilst a good sandbox designer will focus on accounting for every player input and have the world respond to that accordingly. A good sandbox designer will eschew the need to be bigger and instead focus on making what environments they do create detailed and dense. It's the difference between simply generating a space for the player to go nuts in and actually writing the world they inhabit, making it consistent with the game's themes and tone. This is what makes worlds feel lived in. This is what makes worlds immersive and memorable, even if the reaction from the world isn't necessarily realistic, as we've seen with games like Hitman for instance. As long as it is consistent with whatever action the player carries out, the player will feel like they are able to shape the world, even if, in reality, the designer is shaping the player. And that concludes another episode of Writing on Games. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and feel free to discuss your favourite sandbox games with me and your reasons for liking them. Also, if you enjoy the show, if you take the time to check my Patreon page and consider pledging, I'd greatly appreciate it. A massive thank you to my patrons for making this show possible, including Artyom, Nico, Callum, Christian, Jeff, Gareth, Ossian, Red, Jess, Matthew, Adam, Charlie, Patrick, Gary, Gerald, Joe, Luca, Ben, Chris, Morgan, Dylan, Robert and Bruno. I'll need to find a more lung-friendly way of thanking you guys in the future, but trust me, you are all the best. And with that, that concludes another episode of Writing on Games. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.